Hey, have you taken a good look at the banks lately? On the surface, everything seems fine, but there's a whole lot more going on underneath. It's like looking under the hood of a car and finding a mess of broken wires and parts. Truth is, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. Why risk your money for a tiny 5% return when things are so shaky? This is where Noble Gold Investments can help. They know how you can keep your money safe. They suggest gold and silver, oldies but goodies in the financial world. Plus, they've got a sweet deal, a free quarter-ounce gold standard coin this month if you qualify. Pretty cool, right? If you're curious, just give them a call at 877-646-5347. It's just a chat, no pressure. They'll help you figure out if gold and silver are right for you. Or visit noblegoldinvestments.com and take the first step towards a safer financial future.
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers. Jean Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in for this kind of special live stream, special edition on this evening of, what's today? Thursday, February 8th, 2024. We are healthy, wealthy, whole, and free. And we just, I just sat here for 2 hours straight, a little over 2 hours, and watched the probably interview of the year between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. Now, here's a dead giveaway. It thankfully so did not live up to the apocalyptic scenarios that the mainstream media was painting, that Hillary Clinton was painting, and all the others. It was the hyperbole, if you will, was definitely not there, which would be very unusual for Vladimir Putin anyways. And I say this because I have watched many, many interviews before that were not as accessible to the Western world. They were oftentimes by European media or even, media outlets like Al Jazeera. And you had Russian interviews. I've watched inaugurational speeches, and I've seen many, many Putin speeches. So I will say this right away. The benefit of this interview to the world is that if people watch the full 2 hours, which I recommend everybody does, is that it exposes the thinking, the mentality, the rationales, and maybe even the lies, who knows, of President Putin to a completely different audience. Just while we were watching the interview on TuckerCarlson.com, it's already in probably around 20 million views on X and counting. And so I assume that this interview will probably be seen by 1 billion people in a very short period of time. And this in and of itself is extremely positive. So I'm going to break down what was discussed, how it was discussed. This is completely my fresh analysis, my take. I'm not claiming to know the motives. I'll give you first an analysis of the two people involved, Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. I've seen many, many, many media appearances by both. So I'll say this about Tucker. This was definitely completely new for him. He's interviewed the U.S. president. He's interviewed the previous U.S. president. He's interviewed everyone from Britney Spears to Donald Trump and other personalities. And he's a great, great interviewer. He does a great job at that. I will say that he was definitely tense. I will say that his usual tactics that he has, he did not apply. I want to say in the beginning, probably non-voluntarily, because he was to a certain degree a little intimidated. That's my perception. And then he absolutely grew into the interview. And by the end of the interview, you saw some of the Tucker that you know, more conversational, throwing in questions a little more spontaneously. Now, Vladimir Putin began answering Tucker's first question, which he kind of wanted to go into action right away. And Putin did what Putin does. He gave historic context, and he gave pretty extensive historic context over about 30 minutes with a few interruptions. And he wasn't bothered by Tucker in terms of, he said, you have to let me finish because this is important so we can have a real conversation. And he asked Tucker, do you want to have a serious conversation, or is this going to be a show? And so Tucker said a serious conversation. And so that's where the tone was, which I think is so important because all of our Western media, especially in the US, I'm not going to lie, especially in the US, it has turned into just a show, right? It's a screaming match. It's hyperbole. It's talking points. It's all of that. And this was a serious conversation. This was something that actually is warranted given the situation that we're all in. So we saw some serious talk. We saw some real geopolitical talk. And so he went into the historic context, how Russia came about, the history of the Rus, what people came to Russia when, how it was Christianized. He talked about that too, right? How the Orthodox Christianity came into Russia, what significance it has throughout the interview, especially in the beginning. And then he shared about the territory of Ukraine, how much changes have happened over time. Then also what happened in the formation of the Soviet Union, what influence Stalin and Lenin had on that, on the Ukraine, what nationalities were there. And he explained something that I came out when basically the escalation of this conflict in 2022 started. People call it the invasion of Russia, but I think, like Putin said, and many others, this has started way before that, 2014 and earlier. But basically, I said when that happened, I came out and I said, watch, you have to really be careful. This is such a complex situation. We're talking about two multi-ethnic nations, Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, a very complex history, many nationalities, Hungarians in there, the Russians. I mean, the Russians are dominantly in the Ukraine, right? I mean, so many Russian people there, Russian language, Russian culture. The Romanians are there and others. And so this is a complex situation that you can't just explain in a 2-minute soundbite. So he did that really well. I would suggest you listen to it. I think it was historically factual, right? I mean, naturally, unless you are there and you're familiar with the intricacies, you wouldn't be able to verify. But a lot of these things, I think, were can be verified with historic sources as far as we can trust historic sources, of course. What is apparent, maybe to the first-time viewer more than to those who are familiar with Putin, is in stark contrast. If you listen to Western leaders, if you listen to the U.S. president, the current guy in the White House, let's call him that, the resident, if you listen to UK prime ministers in recent administrations and years, it's sort of like it's this child talk, the way they speak to the people, whether they are really unintelligent or they just use a very childish kind of language. Putin doesn't do that. He is speaking like an adult would be speaking to other adults, and he is doing his best to simply portray complex situations. He does that very well. I think he's a very intelligent man. I always thought of him as that. And this is not in support. You can say that Hitler was a highly intelligent man, by the way, and most other very let's just say people that had a lot of impact on the world stage were extremely intelligent people. So let's just take that. That's a given. And so it later went on a little more into what has happened with the relationship between the West and Russia. And like Putin has said so many times before, and I think this is also something that can be historically verified, I agree with him on that, is that when the Soviet Union dissolved, nations were sort of clearly defined, the former member nations of the Soviet Union, and there was sort of an understanding with the West that now there could be a more peaceful, a more harmonious relationship. One of the hallmarks of this peaceful, harmonious relationship was to be an understanding that Russia was not going to try to expand into other nations, and NATO, as the alliance, the Western alliance, was not going to expand beyond where it was at that point in the early 90s. And it didn't happen that way. He talked about how he has had personal conversations with Clinton and later Bush, and that both presidents had said to him one thing in conversations, and then agencies and respective agencies that are involved in such processes, they talked it back and basically there was an example he brought with President Clinton, and he said, would NATO be willing to talk about Russia joining NATO? And Clinton said, he thinks that would be a possibility. That I'm paraphrasing. And later that day, representatives of other agencies told Clinton apparently that's not an option. So Clinton had to come back to Putin and said, well, apparently at this time that's not an option. And of course we've heard about this many times before, but the gist of it is that I do believe that there was a will on the side of Russia and Putin at that time to come closer and collaborate closer. That's never really been disputed, to be quite honest. So, okay, what else do we have here? I made a whole list, so you stick with me. I think it's very interesting. They talked about of course, the war in the Ukraine and how this has started. The escalation had started in 2014 with the from the Russian side contested election, where Putin claims that the U.S. and a Western alliance has meddled in the 2014 elections, and even before that, is what he said, installed in an unconstitutional manner a pro-Western leader at that point, and everything was escalated from there on out. And I will jump forth because I made these bullet points, and it's a few pages of those, by the way, as I was listening to the conversation, and I'm ordering it in my head here while I'm talking. So we might jump back and forth a little bit. Tucker Carlson, and that's how the interview was, by the way. There was jumping back and forth. Tucker Carlson asked him about Nord Stream. The Nord Stream pipeline was bombed and which caused a lot of problems for Europe, for Germany, for the Central and other European nations that have depended on cheap Russian gas for since the Second World War and on. And that's how basically how the European economy was built, how you had a strong Germany, a strong Austria and all that, because they had very, very cheap Russian gas to build their industry on. So it is an open secret. And he was asked, Tucker said, well, who did CIA destroy Nord Stream? And he said, well, you have to ask two questions here. Who is an interested party who would benefit from it? And then he said, who has the ability? He said, in this particular instance, there's not a lot of organizations in the world or nations or militaries or agencies that have the capability to go that deep into the sea and cause such an explosion. He said there's a small list. So that's how he viewed it. But he also said that obviously American analysts and journalists have already come to a conclusion. And of course, we've heard that, the working theory is that it was a special operation that was trained in Panama City, Florida, and that it collaborated with the Norwegians on the bombing of Nord Stream. So, this was one part of the conversation. I will say this, that the general tone, aside from a few very clear statements on part of Putin on all of these subjects, was surprisingly non-confrontational. He didn't point a lot of fingers. That's what I'm saying is, if you're used to listening to American politicians talk and the finger pointing and the hyperbole and the hype, you're going to be in for a different experience. And it's also not the Russian manner. It's not the Slavic manner to talk like that. So he was not jumping at any opportunity to point the finger directly. And many times when he referred to a conversation with former presidents, with Biden, with Trump, with Bush, he would say, this is what I said. Now you have to go back, he said to Tucker, you have to go back and ask your president or your former president what his reply was. It is not my place to say that. He said one absolutely interesting statement that's going to... He made a really interesting analogy. Tucker kind of said that the world is divided in two hemispheres. And Putin basically agreed with that assessment and said it's interesting. The world is divided into hemispheres, and sort of right now, a common Russian expression is it serves the golden billion. So 1 billion people that live way above the standard of all the others. And there's another reference to that golden billion as well. That's kind of backhanded, is that the idea of the depopulation agenda is to maybe keep around 1 billion people and let the rest go. But he basically said that division is sort of like a human brain. A human brain is divided into two hemispheres, and both hemispheres have a function. Like one is more analytical, logical, one is more creative. And so he said, as long as they're at odds with each other, there's not going to be peace. There's not going to be a good solution. So he basically suggested that the world will have to come together. The hemispheres will have to come together to create partnerships in essential areas, which we're going to get into, and that it is highly important that this happens. He wasn't calling for a global government or anything like that, but simply, I thought it was a very, very beautiful analogy, actually. I thought it was a good analogy with the hemispheres. I think I like that one. He did at multiple points say that whatever problem we're looking at today, it can be remedied, and that people just need to come together basically and talk. He was cocky, don't get me wrong. He was cocky on certain other topics, and clearly said, well, I'm not going to call Biden and beg him to not supply weapons to the Ukraine. Why would I do that? He said to that situation that the world knows, that the other world leaders know, that Russia is going to defend its legitimate interests, no matter what it costs. However, he did insinuate often throughout the interview that he's willing to talk. He's willing to negotiate and sit down. We're going to get into what happened with the agreement that was already on the table, I believe in March of last year, what happened there. And he said that the fighting could have stopped then. So let's go a little bit into some of the other subjects that they covered. They covered the US dollar and how he doesn't understand. I think oftentimes what he said was there is a tendency, even in US politics, especially in the way they express things, politicians, administrations, is to be very emotional about certain subjects. And he said, well, the US dollar is clearly on the way out, and this is not an emotional issue. It's actually a very logical issue. You just have to look at what has happened. He said it was a mistake. It was a mistake that could have been, that was foreseeable, that the United States using, or various governments or administrations using the US dollar as the single tool to shape and manipulate and force certain developments in the world, was always going to backfire, because all of US dominance was built on that currency. So eventually what we're seeing now was bound to happen, according to Putin, where everybody is now downsizing their dollar holdings. And he has also provided some figures that should be probably verifiable as to how Russia has changed, and their economy has changed. So he said what the United States did and the collective West did is put sanctions on Russia, where they didn't allow them to trade in dollars for certain essential sections of the economy. So they thought, at least that's the official rationale, that was going to collapse Russia's economy. What really happened was that Russia increased its trade in ruble, it increased its trade in yuan, and is doing better than ever, has much more bilateral trade both ways with China, doing much better. They increased the volume and are having basically a very solid and stable economy, versus Europe, for example, who is really badly hurt by those sanctions. We know that. Ask any European. We know that. That's not a Russian propaganda. That is a fact. They greatly suffered from the sanctions of Russia not being allowed to use the currencies for certain things, and greatly suffered from the sanctions, or the collective decision to not accept Russian gas, or just minimal amounts, sanction that, put all kinds of roadblocks in the way. And so he said both the US and Europe are basically cutting themselves, And he does not understand. He says, of course he does. He does not understand why they're doing it. Okay, so what else do we have? Basically, he did say to Tucker at one point, he looked at him and said, "Do you understand? Do you understand what is happening here?" And he went on to say, "The world is changing so rapidly, and for some reason, you," and he basically said, "your government isn't understanding what is really happening here. How BRICS has surpassed G7 by a substantial margin, that the G7 nations, the former strongest economic nations in the world, are now behind the BRICS nations, and that is a trend that is only expanding." Okay, he did talk about basically Tucker asked him about, is it a problem that China is so strong in the BRICS nations, and that they might be the new dictatorship that's going to rule over every other BRICS nation? And he said something to, look, you can't choose your neighbors, just like you can't choose your family. They're used to having a more than 1,000-mile long border with China, and they are in a good state with China, in a good relationship, and they have, in his words, I'm paraphrasing, found a good way to coexist with each other. He said it's pragmatic, it's practical, and he said really something that kind of caught me a little off guard. He said, that the Chinese are much more diplomatic and willing to compromise than the Europeans and the Western alliances. I thought that was a very bold statement, because it's, of course, in our perception in the West, completely different, just the opposite. He suggested that it's inevitable for the United States to cooperate closer with China unless they want to be completely obliterated economically. This is his words. Let me see. There was talk about, as I said earlier, previous presidents like Bush and Clinton, and he made an interesting statement about Bush definitely not being a stupid country boy like he was portrayed here in the United States and even in Europe. He said that he had a good grasp and understanding of how things really worked, and that they had some very fruitful talks over the 8 years that Bush was president. Probably described relationships with other foreign leaders less in a emotional manner, than more in a were we able to work out strategic partnerships? Were we able to come to certain agreements? Is this a reasonable partner? What he did say, and he said basically, again, I'm paraphrasing, is the way I understood it. He said, it is a problem for me as president of my nation that when I come to a conclusion with a president of your nation, that apparently what we agree on sometimes changes. And I wonder who has the authority to change that, whether the president really has the authority, because on many occasions, things that were agreed upon just were walked back by other people that were then speaking on behalf of the United States. So there was this, it was a subtle hint at the secret powers behind the doors, behind closed doors, and behind the scenes, maybe deep state, but there was none of that language. There was none of that hyperbole language, none of the deep state, none of that. Many subjects that sadly were not covered, but it was a 2-hour conversation, and I guess you can't do everything in 2 hours. What he did say was that the Western alliance, and this is about the relationship, why it is so rocky, why it's gotten so bad. And he said, basically, from a Russian standpoint, the only tool in communications since the fall of the Soviet Union was sort of like a hammer. He said it was all about always pressure, 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 pressure. And he said that friends shouldn't put each other under pressure all the time, that negotiations could have been more fruitful if they weren't under this umbrella of pressure all the time. He said, and again, I'm just stating what he said, he was in strong support and suggested a shared missile defense shield. When NATO expansion happened, when they were starting to covering the eastern flank of Europe and whatnot, and that he was suggesting that it would be a good thing to do it together with Russia. It would eliminate a lot of problems, create greater security. and that he was shut down, that he was, and they were shut down, and that was a non-starter. So the question was then by Tucker, do you believe that Zelensky, as the president of the Ukraine, has the authority to negotiate a peace deal with you? And then he said something to the extent of, well, he perceives himself to be the president. The Ukrainian people that stand behind him look at him as a president, and apparently the Western Alliance views him as a president. So why wouldn't he have the authority? I thought that was an interesting statement. I'm not going to interpret it. I just gave it to you, and you do with that what you wish. So they said, like I mentioned before, in 2023, March of 2023, in Istanbul, in Turkey, they negotiated a peace deal for the Ukraine, and certain points on that peace deal were already agreed upon and even initialed, not fully signed yet, but initialed. And that basically how it came out was that then the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, came in on behalf of Biden or the Biden administration and persuaded Zelensky to step back. No, we're going to have to fight this war out. We're not going to go negotiate. And so basically, from Putin's view, is it was there, it was on the table. This could have ended in March of 23. Now the ball is in their corner. This can still be negotiated, but the ball's in their corner. That's basically what he said. They talked a little bit about the Russian culture, about his Christianity, and whether he can be, as a world leader, like any world leader of any significant nation, will have to do some killing, whether that's a strategic strike against a terrorist target or a full-blown war. And Tucker asked him, how do you Jesus says turn the other cheek, yet as the president of Russia, you clearly had to authorize killings. How do you bring these two together? And basically he said, I'm most definitely in my heart a Christian, and that I do believe as a Christian I have the right to defend myself, my nation, my culture. That's kind of where that went. He did emphasize the strong importance of the motherland and the family in Russia, and how the two are absolutely interconnected. He basically, not so many words, said, listen, we have a very strong form of patriotism here. People believe in the family as the foundational element of a nation and the motherland, and that the two are very, very much connected. He talked about the Russian soul and how strong it is in his view, and he didn't say it in a he said that's not a bad thing, but he said he believes that the Western cultures have a more pragmatic view and not such a soul-centered view. Now, this might sound very some sort of counterintuitive to how many people perceive Russians. However, I will say that in general, Slavic cultures are very soul-oriented and very spirit-oriented. Now, that's not to say there are not bad apples and wars and all the problems that are everywhere in the world, but that is true. Those are my roots as well. So I'm not just speaking from observation, but personal experience. Then the conversation went to AI. It went a little bit first into the empires, and Putin sort of compared what had happened with the Roman Empire and how the fall of the Roman Empire had happened, but it took 500 years, and that we're seeing a lot of the same elements. However, that today's time is so much faster and everything happens in a much faster, compressed time. So he does see the world as rapidly changing. He was asked by Tucker, when will the AI empire emerge? And he thought for a while and said, listen, this is a very complex subject. And a lot of people have more knowledge and data on this. However, he said, I will say this, that when gunpowder was invented, it could not be stopped. There's nothing that could have stopped gunpowder. And then he said, when the weapons got more sophisticated, that could not be stopped either. But when the nuclear age began in the 20th century, nations understood that they had to come together to negotiate certain deals, because it was going to be a life or death thing with nuclear weapons. Those are his words, where he said that we knew this is annihilation for everybody, so we have to find agreements. And then he talked about the developments in genetics and AI and how those developments warrant the same response by the international community, that there will have to be international agreements as to the limitations on how these technologies are used, because they have even more potential to have irreversible effects on a human family, right? So I thought that was sort of a very important and kind of diplomatic thing to say. All over, I will say, there was a sort of a non-willingness to burn a bridge during this interview, in my perception. This is my perception. Ultimately, he clearly said, I want to negotiate. We want to negotiate a settlement. It was pretty non-combative, but you have to watch the whole interview. If you're going to, most people will just watch little bits and pieces, like little 1-minute clips and 2-minute clips. And you can make anything look like anything in 2 minutes, right? If you put it together the right way and some mannerisms, then you'll maybe think, oh, that guy's just cocky and aggressive. That's not what he was putting out there. During this interview, he was collected, he was thoughtful, he was intelligent, he was smart, but he's Putin. There's a track record, there's a history, no doubt about it. And there's a clear statement also that they will defend Russian interests till the end. It's clear. But, and this is what we didn't hear from any other world leaders other than one who is not in office right now. And that's what I said before. And this is not a sign of support for anyone, but Trump is the only one who said that. We have to get to the table. And when he was pressed, remember, Trump was pressed at the CNN town hall to say who should win the war. And he was said, well, don't you want Ukraine to win? He said, I want the war to stop. I want the killing to stop. Everybody should stop dying. And I sort of, it wasn't that from Putin, but from Putin it was, well, if they want to talk, we can talk. We were there already. We can get there again. So I think ultimately, probably the propaganda media will spin this in a completely different way. I know the politicians will spin it differently. In my view, the door was opened in a very good way. It was not. There will be criticism that Tucker didn't push against more, but I do not think that is the role of a true journalist. A journalist is not there to sort of hold the moral high ground or even have the role of having to remind the interviewee of what is supposedly right. The role of a true journalist is to have this conversation, ask the tough questions, ask the right questions, listen to the responses, and then share it with the audience and let them make up their own mind. So I think that's really important. So I encourage you to go there, go to tuckercarlson.com or go on X, formerly Twitter. This might even be posted to YouTube. Now, we can't share any of it because of copyright restrictions. This is my take on it. I think all in all, this can be, if chosen to, a very positive thing. It is not earth-shattering with any revelations that came out that will like break the internet, because there weren't any that those who were already watching hadn't heard before. He didn't share something fundamentally new that we haven't heard from Putin before. Like I said, what is fundamentally new, that Tucker Carlson is currently reaching an audience in the hundreds of millions. He's known all over the world. He's known in Europe. He is known in the UK. He's known in many places that you wouldn't think. And this can definitely have a positive effect, not in terms of let's root for Russia, let's root for Ukraine, but bring people or bring enough pressure so that a deal is negotiated, and whatever hostilities and battles are going on can stop. And that's never a bad thing in my book. So I won't go tonight into all the theories around Putin, whether he's Putin 2.0, whether he's a clone. It's not the time and place for this. This is a different purpose here. So this is my take. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for allowing me to share it. We'll probably talk some more about it, we'll have some guests that will weigh in. All in all, I'm glad it was a level-headed conversation, and that it's not going to sort of cause a international crisis. Now, I'm curious to see what the resident had to say. That he apparently came on at 7, or will come on right now in a few minutes, or already was. I don't know. At any rate, thank you so much for tuning in. We love you. We appreciate you. We'll be back with you again very, very soon.